And and Doron's take, first he's going to give us a little bit of a background and his take on not only Hanukkah, but this is then going to be really a set induction, not only giving us this piece, but a set induction for an ongoing three-part series about Hanukkah and about modern connective pieces to Hanukkah. So this all goes together very well like a jigsaw puzzle. And so I'm quite excited. Doren is really quite an accomplished scholar. And one of the beautiful pieces of this pandemic is that we are able to study and to learn with great scholars from Israel. We just have to, either they have to be willing to go to bed late or wake up early. And so obviously Doren is willing to go to bed late, and I guess he's not willing, more willing to go to bed late because I guess he figures he must have, the early bird catches the worm, right? But I guess none of us really want to be the early worm. So with that, I go to Doren. Bevakasha.
Okay, thank you very much for the introduction. I would need an option to share screen.
I will absolutely do that.
Okay. So I'm very happy. It's my first visit to Vancouver.
Oh, you know what, Diane, I think you have to do it because I'm only a co-host. Sorry about
that. So I've never been to Canada, and so it's my first visit.
Oh, sorry. Doren, yeah, you're good.
Okay.
I muted you by accident.
You can hear me now?
Yes, sorry about that.
Okay, great. So I'm very excited to be in Vancouver and to meet you all. And I'm going to talk about Hanukkah, which is going to start in a week and a half from now. Hanukkah is quite a weird, bizarre holiday because if we think about the other historical holidays that we have in the Jewish calendar, which is actually Purim and Passover, the other holidays are not exactly historical from their subject. They're more spiritual or somewhat less historical. And I think every kindergarten child knows the story of Purim, and every kindergarten child knows the story of Passover. If we're going to go to the street and ask every person in Israel and every person in your community and even 5-year-old, they will know to tell the basic story of Purim and of Passover. That's because basically we read every year the whole story. If it's in the Haggadah in Leila Seder, or if it's in Megillat Esther in Purim, we hear the story again and again until we know it very well. But Hanukkah is a bit strange because most people, even educated and even well-read in the Jewish sources, don't exactly know what happened in Hanukkah. They know it has to do with oil and about latkes and sufganiot and donuts. But what exactly happened, that's a very complicated story, and I'll try to make it as short and as simple as possible in the next few minutes. One second. Okay. So if we want to understand the story of Hanukkah, we have to go back about 2,300 years ago to the period of Alexander the Great. Alexander the Great is known not only because of his conquests, his huge empire that was built all the way from Greece to India in a few short years of occupations, but also because of the Hellenistic period he started. This whole connection between East and West, between the Greek culture and the Eastern cultures, Middle Eastern cultures. But after Alexander the Great passed away, his huge kingdom was torn apart between his generals, and the basic and the main two kingdoms that came out of this mess were the Ptolemaic rule, that the Ptolemaic kingdom that was in Egypt, and the Seleucid kingdom empire that was in the northern part of the empire, basically Iran, Iraq, and Syria of today. And as you can see, the land of Israel, Palestine, is exactly in the middle between the Ptolemaic and the Seleucid empires. And actually, it was the playground of the two big empires. It went from one side to the other until 200 BC, the Syrian Greeks, or the Seleucid Empire, started ruling in Judea for the next few decades. So our story basically starts at around 200 BC. And at that point in time, we meet Antiochus, the king of the Seleucid Empire. And if we go to Josephus Flavius, the ancient Jewish historian, we read a very interesting story that Antiochus tells the Jews of Jerusalem. Since the Jews, upon their first entrance to our first entrance to their country, demonstrated their friendship towards us, and when we came to their city, received us in splendid manner, and came to meet us, and gave abundance of provisions to our soldiers and to our elephants. That's quite complicated to get enough food for the elephants of the Seleucid army, and helped us to get rid of the Ptolemies. Then we're going to give them, you can read in the next few sentences, we're going to give them animals for sacrifice, for wine and oil and money for the temple. That's quite strange, because Antiochus, as we remember from all the Hanukkah stories we read as children, as adults, Antiochus is supposed to be the bad guy. So how come, if we read those sentences in Josephus' Antiquities, how come he's so nice to the Jews? Well, that's because that's the wrong Antiochus. This is Antiochus III, the father of Antiochus IV, which is the main hero or the villain of the Hanukkah story. So basically, if we see the first meeting between the Seleucid Empire and the Jews in the land of Israel, it's the beginning of a wonderful friendship. The Jews helped the Seleucid Greeks to conquer the land of Israel. Antiochus, the Seleucid king, gives the Jews a lot of rights and autonomy and a lot of help with the temple. So basically, the story starts well. If we look at the Jewish culture of the time in the land of Israel, we see that there is a lot of Hellenization. We can see here a very long list of Greek words that entered the Hebrew language. Most of those words are very common today. We can even see sufganiya, which is the donut we eat in Hanukkah. It's actually a Greek word. And if we look in the middle of the list, we can even see my first name, Doren, which means in Hebrew and in Greek, present. So even if my name is Greek, I have to check exactly, are we Hellenized or are we faithful to our Jewish orientation? So we see a lot of Greek or Hellenized buildings in Judea. We see a lot of words. Even some of the sages we can see have Greek names like Antigonos, others. So basically, we see there is a good connection with the Greek rulers. We can see there is Hellenized aspirations in Judea, a lot of words, a lot of different points of Greek culture and Jewish society. Then things go astray. As we can see, the story starts with a person called Jason, who is a Jew. He has a Greek name, which is interesting, but he's a Jew and he's a priest, and he wants to be the high priest. So he goes to the king, to Antiochus IV, and promised him 360 talents of silver. And then he promised him even more if he will get a license to set him up for a place of exercise of Greek culture and a place for youth, and to entitle them that were in Jerusalem Antiochians. It's a very hard verse in Maccabees here, what exactly happened there. But we can see that the high priest, or the new high priest, Yason, tries to bring the Greek culture more and more into Jerusalem. But we can see in the next paragraph, now this was not the beginning, but an increase and a progress of Hellenist and foreign manners, in so much that the priests were now occupied with the offices of the altar, despising the temple and neglecting the sacrifices. So basically, most of the people in Jerusalem, or many of the people in Jerusalem, went after the Greek sports and Greek culture, and a bit forgot about their Jewish culture. But things get a bit more messy, a bit more complicated in the next few years. We see the beginning of persecution. Antiochus IV compelled the Jews to depart from the law of their fathers and of God. And we see anti-Jewish rules that forbid the Jews from keeping the Shabbat and about observing different Jewish rules. Why exactly Antiochus put out those rules, those anti-Jewish rules, anti-religious rules? Nobody exactly knows. That's a very big question that many historians in the last 200 years try to explain historically. We don't exactly know what happened there. And we'll talk about it more later on. So many of the Jews had no choice but to accept those rules. But some of them wanted to object. And we see the beginning of anti-Antiochus revolt, headed by Matityahu, the son of Johanan the priest. He lives in a small village called Modi'in, not far away from Jerusalem, and he has 5 sons. And one morning, there is someone sent from King Antiochus, and he came to Modi'in, and he tried to get them to sacrifice to Zeus, to the Greek god, and Matityahu objects. He's not willing to compel to it. He takes out his knife, he kills the Greek soldier and the Jew that wanted to put the sacrifice over there for the Zeus. And Matityahu cried out in the city, saying, everyone that has zeal for the law, for the Jewish law, for the Torah, let him follow me. Mi le'Hashem elai. This revolt actually had no chance. The Seleucid Empire is a huge empire. They have elephants. They have 100,000 soldiers. They have military ships. They're the biggest and strongest empire in the Middle East. Matityahu and his 5 sons are not exactly a military that can offer any challenge to the Seleucid Empire, but slowly, more and more people join them. Matityahu passed away, and his middle son, Judas Maccabeus, heads the revolt. And in 9 battles, which is kind of symbolic if you think about the Hanukkah candelabra, he takes the rebels against the huge Seleucid Empire, and in Ma'ale Levona, in Ma'ale Bet Horon, in Emmaus, in all those areas around Jerusalem, and in the middle, in Jerusalem itself. He loses two battles in Bet Zechariah, where his brother Eliezer is crushed under the elephant, and in his last battle, where Judas Maccabeus dies in the battle against the Seleucid. But in the other 7 battles, he wins, and he heads on the rebels to take Jerusalem back, to clear the temple from all the avodah zarah, from all the foreign sacrifices. And Judas, who had no military knowledge, had no military experience, becomes one of the biggest generals in Jewish history. We're not going to go into all the Hashmonaean dynasty, all the brothers of Judea, of Judas Maccabeus and his nephews. But if we look at those years, and for the next 100 years or so, from the liberation of the temple and the abolishment of the decrees by Judas Maccabeus, we see a treaty with the Roman Republic, which is quite a diplomatic accomplishment. Then his brother Jonathan becomes a high priest with a recognition from the Seleucid Empire. 10 years later, his other brother Simon becomes a prince and a high priest, and actually the Seleucid Empire recognizes the independence of the Jewish state. And afterwards, the son of Simon, John Hyrcanus, becomes a prince and a high priest. Alexander Yanai, John Hyrcanus' son, becomes the king. Afterwards, his wife, Shlom Tzion Alexandra, becomes the only queen in Jewish history. All of that until the Roman occupation under Pompey in 63 BC. So for 100 years or so, we have a Jewish state headed by the Hashmonaeans, and their coins that we see here with the corns of plenty. This is a coin of John Hyrcanus. Still is remembered by the Jewish or the Israeli new 2 shekels coin. You can see that exactly the same design of the coins of plenty. And all of that is the basic story of Hanukkah, the story of decrees by Antiochus against the Jewish religion, a revolt that has no chance but somehow wins a series of accomplishments in the diplomatic and military places, and independence, Jewish state for the first and last time until the modern state of Israel. That's the basic story of Hanukkah. I tried to make it as simple and as short as possible. But then we have to ask the question, where do you know that? We know the story of Passover from the book of Exodus and from the Haggadah of Pesach. We know the story of Purim from Megillat Esther. But if we ask the person in the street, where exactly do we know the story of Hanukkah? Most of the people won't exactly be sure, except the stories in kindergarten or in school, where exactly the story came. So actually we have not only a book, we have 2 books to tell the story of Hanukkah. 1 Maccabees and 2 Maccabees. But it's not exactly the same as 1 Samuel, 2 Samuel, or the first book of Kings and second book of Kings in the Bible, because first Maccabees and second Maccabees are not 2 parts of the same book, but they're 2 different books. First book of Maccabees was written in Hebrew in the Hashmonite kingdom. It's written in Hebrew in biblical style. We'll see some examples of it later on. The second book of Maccabees was written in Greek, in a very Hellenistic style, full of pathos and various Hellenistic style objects. As I said, first book of Maccabees was written in Judea, where the second book of Maccabees was written in Kyrene, which is in modern Libya. And the period of time that the first book of Maccabees covers is from 168 BC until 134 BC, the beginning of the rule of John Hyrcanus, which is actually the second generation of the Hashmonite family. Whereas the second book of Maccabees starts a bit earlier, about 10 years earlier than the first book, 178 BC, and it stops in the middle of the story while Judea Maccabeus is still alive in his last battle, or next to last battle, when he wins against the Greek general Nicanor. So we have two different books which tell two different stories. Now the question I would like to check in the next few minutes is, what story does the first book of Maccabees tell us, and what story does the second book of Maccabees tell us? Before I go on to try and see a few of the parts of the different book of Maccabees, are there any questions? Anyone want to ask any questions about the story I told so far? Okay.
I have a question, Doren.
Yeah.
You would think that the Seleucids were very upset that they lost those battles. So why would they have a treaty? Why wouldn't they just do what the Romans did 100 or 200 years later and come in and just wipe everybody out?
It's a very good question, because like I said, the Seleucid Empire is a huge army, the strongest empire in the Middle East, but they are not Superman. They're not like the Roman Empire of 100 years later. They have a lot of problems, a lot of internal problems, a lot of revolts in the various parts of their huge empire, multicultural, multinational empire. And like we saw in Afghanistan last few years, even big empires have their limitations. So the Seleucids prefer a small, weak kingdom next to them that they can coexist with them, instead of spilling blood and wasting blood and money in a long war against those rebels. That's the short possible answer to a very good question. We're going to read a few parts from the two books of Maccabees and try to see the differences between them. Like I said, one was written originally in Hebrew, but both of them got to us through the Christian Biblia in translation to Greek. But it's very obvious to see that the Greek of the second book of Maccabees is a very good Greek, written in the highest level of Greek, whereas the first book of Maccabees is a very weak. The basis over there is very Hebrew and very biblical, and even Greeks that try to read it, the first book of Maccabees, feel that the whole grammar and the whole structure of the book is very, very biblical and not originally Greek. Okay, so the texts are very long. I didn't bring the whole book because over here it's night, so I don't want to go to sleep too late. But we're going to read a few parts. Can you see the text? Is it? Okay. When we go to the first book of Maccabees, and we have to ask ourselves, how does the story begin in the two books? When we go to the first book of Maccabees, we see that the story begins with Alexander the Great. Now that it came to pass after that Alexander, the son of Philip the Macedonian, who first reigned in Greece, and then came out of them, of the Greek rulers, Antiochus the Epiphanes. In those days, there went out of Israel a wicked man, and they persuaded many, saying, "Let us go and make covenant with the heathens that are around about us." And then he gave them license to do the ordinance of the heathens, and they built a place of exercise in Jerusalem according to the laws of the nations. The first book of Maccabees, again written in Judea in Hebrew, tells that out of the Greek rulers came a wicked root. Antiochus was a very bad person, but the group that we can blame for the beginning of the whole problem was wicked men out of Israel, a certain group. They don't have an exact name over here, but we can call them a very extreme Hellenized Jews that live in Jerusalem. And that's very typical for people who live in Israel. And to pinpoint a blaming finger toward the whole group, whether it's the left wing or the right wing, the religious or the secular, there is always one group in Israel who's to be blamed for everything. That's a very Israeli point of view. So the Goyim, the non-Jews are to be blamed, and there is a certain group, the extreme Hellenized Jews, that we can't count on them. They created the whole problem. When we go to the second book of Maccabees, we see a different beginning of the story. Therefore, when the holy city was inhabited with all the peace, of course, Jerusalem, and the laws as yet were very well kept because of the godliness of Onias the high priest, the hatred they saw head of evil, it came to pass that even the kings themselves and the princes esteemed, of course, the non-Jews kings and princes esteemed the temple worthy of the highest honor and glorified the temple with great gifts. And then one Simon of the tribe of Benjamin, who was appointed overseer of the temple, strove in opposition the high priest to bring about some unjust thing in the city. We're not going to read the whole part. If you want, I can later on send the paper. But we see that the Jewish writer that sits in Cyrene, in Libya, and writes in Greek, has to take into account that some of his readers are non-Jews. So he can't point a blaming finger toward all the non-Jews. And he doesn't want to say that there is a whole group of Jews that are not okay, that they are to be blamed. So he said there is one problematic Jew, Simon, from the tribe of Benjamin. So we see the first book of Maccabees, written in Israel, says there is a whole group of Jews that they are the problematic ones. Second book of Maccabees said there is only one Jew who's problematic. Second book of Maccabees says most non-Jews rulers are okay. They even gave gifts to the temple and they glorified the temple. Most of the non-Jewish kings are quite all right. Whereas first book of Maccabees doesn't give any praise or any doesn't have any good words to say about the non-Jewish rulers. The main word in the second book of Maccabees is written here in English, but it's better to read it in Greek. The holy city, the polis. Jerusalem is a Greek polis from the point of view of the second book of Maccabees, and a polis has to go by the nomoi, the laws, like every Greek polis. When a polis is governed and gets along by the rules, and everything is okay. You can be under the rule of a Greek ruler, and it's great because he gives presents to the temple and everything goes by the rules. But then there is one Simon that makes the whole thing, it gets out of hand. So if we see from the point of view of the first book of Maccabees, there are two problems. First of them is that there is a Greek ruler, which is a wicked person, and that there is a whole group of Jews that are a wicked person. The second book of Maccabees said there is no problem living under Greek rule as long as the city is inhabited with all the peace and the laws are kept, the Jewish laws are kept, like all the polis, all the different cities in the Greek world. So it's one interesting difference between the two books, how they begin the story, who do they blame for the complication of the story. Now we're going to see another part of those two books, and we're going to ask ourselves, who's the hero? What is going to make a change in the plot? Like I said, Antiochus, in the beginning of the story, wants to punish the Jews and takes out orders that the different orders, anti-Jewish, anti-religious orders. How do Jews try to manage with those anti-Jewish orders? We see two different stories in First Maccabees and Second Maccabees. Let's see the part from the first book of Maccabees on the left. Then many that sought after judgment and justice went down to the desert, and for which the king's soldiers went out towards them and made war against them on the Sabbath day. What do you do when you sit in the desert and suddenly Greek soldiers, Seleucid soldiers, come and attack you? And so they ask them, do you still resist? Come forth and do according to the edict of King Antiochus, and you shall live. And those Jews in the desert on the Shabbat say, we will not come forth, neither we obey the king's edicts to profane the Sabbath day, and they will not fight. So the Greek soldiers slay them and kill them with their wives, their children, and their cattle. When Matityahu hears about those Jews that were killed in the desert because they didn't want to fight or run away on Shabbat, Matityahu and his friends heard about it and they mourned. And every man said to his neighbor, if we shall do as our brothers have done, and we will not fight against those Greeks for our lives, they will now quickly root us out of the earth. And they said, if they will come and fight us on Sabbath, we will fight against them, and we will not die as our brothers were slain in the desert. In the next few paragraphs, after the death of Matityahu, Judas Maccabeus, Yehuda, rose up in his stead, and with help he put on a breastplate and put on an armor and took his sword, and he acts like a lion, and like a lion, well roaring for his prey. And salvation prospered in his hand. What exactly is Matityahu and Judas' point of view? What should Jews do against those rules of Antiochus? what should Jews do against those rules? What do you say? Based on first book of Maccabees. Put back the
They
text.
fight.
What's that?
They fight.
Okay. If we will sit down and do nothing, they will kill us all. But if we want the story to change, if we want to have a chance, we have to put on our armor, our weapons, and to go to the battlefield, and salvation will prosper in our hand because we will fight. That's the story. That's the basic change of the story. There are anti-Jewish rules, and if we want a chance to survive as Jews, physically and spiritually, we have to take our faith into our own hands and to go to the battlefield. That's the story from the point of view of the first book of Maccabees. When we go to the second book of Maccabees, we can see battles and we can see the story of Judas Maccabeus in the battlefield. But as we can see here, this and the right column over here is much longer and has much more stories that tell what the author of the second book of Maccabees wants Jews to do when they're in a situation like that. There are a lot of stories. I brought only a glimpse. The actual stories are twice as long. For 2 women were accused to have circumcised their children. They were led about the city with their infants hanging at their breasts and threw down headlong from the walls. And others were burnt with fire because they wouldn't, because they observed the Shabbat. Another person, Elazar, was the chief of the scribes, a person advanced in years. You can see the Greek style of writing. A man advanced in years and of comely countenance, and he was pressed to open his mouth to eat a swine's flesh. But he, choosing rather a most glorious death than a hateful life, went forward voluntarily to the torment. And over there they tell the whole story of him. And he says, "O Lord, with the holy knowledge, and knowest manifestly that whereas I might delivered from death, I suffer grievous pains in body, but in soul I'm well content to suffer these things." And that's the story of Elazar. Then there's the story of the mother and the 7 children. Later on in Jewish heritage, she is known by the name of Hannah, but in the second book of Maccabees, she doesn't have a name. A mother with 7 children that were caught by Antiochus and his soldiers, and they were being compelled to eat a swine's flesh. And over each of the 7 children did, and what is told Antiochus, we see the elder son says, "We are ready to die rather to transgress the laws of God received from our fathers." And then the king put out various methods of torture with frying pans and brazen cauldrons to make hot. And I'm not going to read the whole really terrible various stuff to cut out the tongue of him who is spoken first, the skin of his head being drawn off, and etc., etc. The last of all, after the sons, the mother was also consumed, that he would remember also the most unjust death of innocent children, and the blasphemies offered to his name. So now, when Maccabeus has gathered the multitude, he could not withstood by the heads, for the wrath of God has turned into mercy. There is no swords, there is no armor, there is no weapons. What makes God wants to change his anger, his wrath into mercy is the death of the children and of those innocent children. We see the second book of Maccabees takes the Mavet on Kiddush Hashem, Mavet of innocent women, children, elderly person. That's the right or the most heroistic way to fight against the anti-Jewish force. So again, we see the first book of Maccabees doesn't like Jews dying in vain. He wants Jews to go out to the battlefield. The second book of Maccabees likes the stories of Mavet on Kiddush Hashem, the death of those children and women and elderly people. But there is battles because the story is a story of rebellion and of how Judas Maccabeus led the Jewish rebels to victories against the Greeks. We see that there are different battles in first book of Maccabees and in the second book of Maccabees. But whereas we see the battle against the Seleucid general Gorgias took his soldiers and wanted to attack Judas Maccabeus by night. And then Judas Maccabeus heard of it. He rose up and took his men away from his camp, and he went on a different route because he knew all the different roads in the mountains, and he went and attacked the Seleucid camp in Emmaus. We'll explain again. Whereas the Seleucid general attacks the Jewish camp, the Jewish soldiers are not there. They went on another road to attack the Seleucid camp. When the Greek soldiers, the Seleucid soldiers, come back to their camp after they try to find the Jewish soldiers throughout the night, they come back to their camp and instead of a hot chocolate and a warm bed, they see the Judas Maccabeus and his soldiers waiting for them. We see the story with a lot of tactical details, a lot of places, geographically, places in Judea, a lot of various tactic formations and planning. Now we can see on the right another battle, not the same battle, but a different battle that described by the author of the second book of Maccabees. Judas Maccabeus and the other soldiers drew near, prayed to the Lord, sprinkling earth upon their heads and girding their loins with their hair clothes. And lying prostrate at the foot of the altar, besought him to be merciful to them and to be an enemy to their enemies, an adversary to their adversaries, as the law says. And as soon as the sun has risen, both sides joined battle, the one part, etc., but the other side making their rage and their leader in battle. But when they were in the heat of the engagement, oh, and behold, they appeared to the enemies from heaven, 5 men upon horses. Those 5 men that came from the heaven are, of course, angels that came in the middle of the battle with the golden bridles conducting the Jews. 2 of them took Maccabeus between them and covered him every side with their arms. It kept him safe, and they cast darts and fireballs against the enemy. So, if you want to win a battle in the first book of Maccabees, you better be well prepared. You will have to find tactical solutions to win the battle. In the second book of Maccabees, if you will pray hard enough, angels will come down from the sky and help you out. We can see that even if we don't read the next part, we can just see that the first book of Maccabees is very excited about the liberation of the temple and about the purification of the temple. You can see the different verbs. They cleaned the holy places. They broke the different Greek tools and vessels that were put in the temple. They sanctified the temple. They put incense on the altar. They gave light in the temple. They did a lot of things. And you can see the last sentence in the first book of Maccabees. And in order that such a thing will not happen again, that the holy temple will be in the hands of the Greeks, they built up in Mount Zion high walls and strong towers, lest the Gentiles should at any time come and trade it down. What should the rebels do in order to keep the temple safe? They have to put on towers and to put soldiers in towers, and they will take care of the temple. You can see in the second book of Maccabees that they've purified the temple simply like that, with no hard work, and everything was quite simple. And then they pray to the Lord, lying prostrate on the ground again, that such a thing will not happen again to the temple. There is no building of towers, there is no building of high walls, there is no tactical or army militaristic actions from rebels. If you want to know about a movie or a book or a play, what is the point of this whole book or movie? Of course, you have to go to the end and to see how does the book or the movie end. What exactly is a happy end from the point of view of the writer? Let's try to see in the first book of Maccabees. First book of Maccabees ends after the death or the murder of Simon. Simon is the brother of Judas Maccabeus. He's the Hashmonai ruler that won the independence for the Jewish state. And Simon gets murdered by one of the villains of the book. But his son, Yochanan Hyrcanus, succeeds him. And is considering the rest of the acts of John and his wars, his worthy deeds, which he's bravely achieved, and the building of the walls which he made, and the things that he did, they are written in the books of his day of his priesthood, from the time he was made high priest after his father. That's the happy end from the point of view of first book of Maccabees. Jewish independence, and there is a dynasty. A second generation of the Hashmonai family gets to rule the Jews in Israel, to rule Jerusalem. And what does John Hyrcanus do? He builds walls, he wins wars, and he rules the independent state of Judea. That's a happy end from the point of view of the first book of Maccabees. Let's go to the right part of the page. The holy city and the temple were in danger. Judas Maccabeus went into battle and saved them. Then he prays, he called upon the Lord against. We see a lot of prayers in the second book of Maccabees, calling upon God with his prayers, so fighting with their hands, but praying to the Lord with their hearts. They slew all those Greeks. So these things being done with relation to Nicanor, the Greek general, and from that time the city was possessed by the Hebrews. Let's be reminded how the book started. The first book of Maccabees said, when the holy city was inhabited in all the peace, the police and the laws were kept. And the book ends where the holy city, again, is safe again, because the Jews rule it, and it's possessed by the Hebrews, and the rules are kept. What part of the story is not to be found in the second book of Maccabees? We don't see independence. And independence is not a happy end, or it doesn't have to be a happy end. As long as the holy city and the temple are not in danger, as long as Jews can live in Jerusalem as Jews and to keep their mitzvot and to live as Jews, then everything is okay. A Jew doesn't have to have independence and military and high walls and towers in order to be happy. But if we look at the end of the first book of Maccabees, we see a different story. The story is the story of independence and of military army, of a Jewish army, a Jewish towers and walls and etc. So we have two different stories. Which one do we believe? Because we saw there are a lot of differences. First book of Maccabees tells us one style of story, and the second book of Maccabees tells us another story. What do we do? Which book of Maccabees do we believe?
Doren, was that a rhetorical question, or are we supposed to?
No, I would like to.
I would say both.
Both.
Well, actually, today, in today's terms, we want the military solution because we certainly trust in the arms of human beings. I don't know that we're so comfortable waiting for 5 angels with horses and golden darts. Let's face it, Israel doesn't rely on angels with golden darts, and it relies on on tanks and soldiers. It sounds much more plausible to us.
I agree
But-
with Dean.
Yeah.
I would say that
Mhm.
from the standpoint of what you want people to hear and to remember, most of all, given our history, is number one. But from the standpoint, I was looking at it in terms of how do we pull information from it to determine accuracy, or as close to accuracy as possible, because it's, after all, two different viewpoints. I would say both, because they both, as your work has proven, they both have merit to be able to get to the essence of that history. But what you want to say to people is a different thing.
As we know, history is a short for his story. We don't have accurate histories because each historian writes the history from his point of view. A Jew that lives in the diaspora and looks from far away about on the Hashmonite revolt would like to acknowledge the spiritual point of view, the death of the innocent, the prayers, the miracles, whereas a writer that sits in the Hashmonite ruler in his palace and writes in history in behalf of the ruler, of course wants to tell how great the Hashmonite family is and how great their military accomplishments were. So I don't know if I want to believe someone who politically or financially has a lot to gain from writing for the ruler. So I tend to think that both stories are not accurate. we don't have any accurate stories in history, as we don't have any accurate media today. Each journalist or each politician tells us his story from his point of view. In order to understand the true story, we have to take those two stories and try to see what can't be, what might be a bit exaggerated, and from this point of view, try to build the true story. So actually, there's no true story of Hanukkah. There are two stories, and they're not exactly true, as much as no historical stories is true in 100%, sometimes not exactly in 50%.
I want to just, I apologize. I want to sort of do a bit of a sikkum because it's getting a little late for you. And I want to admit that we did a bait and a switch. We called it the true story of Hanukkah, but the reality is there's no true story of Hanukkah. And that's what we just revealed to you. I want to thank Doren for joining us with his expertise and being late at night. I have to run in just a couple minutes to go teach Jewish history to grade 5 students next door at Talmud Torah. But it was a delight learning with you, and makes me want to come back to learn at both Schechter and Hebrew University, 2 places that you teach and that I had the opportunity to learn at. Dan is going to tell us just a couple little announcements of upcoming programs, and then I'm actually going to connect Diane's announcements back to you, Doren.
Diane is muted. Can you see my screen?
Yeah.
Okay, great. So I also want to thank you, Doren. That was really very interesting. My mom has always said there are 3 sides to every story. There's his side, her side, and the truth. So that's pretty much what you've said, I think. Our next speaker in our Hanukkah series is David Bernstein, whose talk is going to be called The Pen and the Sword in the Warsaw Ghetto. And that's on November 24th, also at a special time at 8 p.m. I also wanted to remind everyone today is the last day to register for our Hanukkah baking class at 3 p.m. sharp cutoff. And we also have our Hanukkah Homecoming event, which is all ages, and it's a hybrid event. So you can come to the synagogue and enjoy some dinner with us and some singing with Cantor Zusman. Or you can zoom into that. And those are my announcements. Thanks, Rabbi.
And thank you. And then maybe Doren, the last presentation of their kind of 3-part Hanukkah stories is Lisa Richland, who just moved back from Israel, talking about modern Israeli politics. And I wonder if you could just take 2 more minutes just to conclude and explain the connection between what you just shared with us and those 2 pieces, those 2 upcoming series, one on the Warsaw Ghetto uprising and the other on modern Israeli politics. And how does this all come together, Doren?
Actually, those 3 stories are very connected, because also in the Warsaw Ghetto, there were different rebel groups, and they didn't get along. There wasn't one big rebellion, but there are different revolts from different political groups that wouldn't want get along with one another. And in Jewish or Israeli politics nowadays, also there's a few problems to get along one with another. And we saw that a Jewish writer that looks from abroad on Judea can't pinpoint the whole Hellenistic Jews as a problem, because first of all, he's a Hellenized Jew, and second of all, when you look outside, you can't say there is a whole part of the Jewish nation which is not good and is corrupt and is problematic, especially if some of your readers are not Jews. But someone who writes in Hebrew, who writes in Judea, can say there's a whole group of Jews, they are the problem. If we just push them aside, everything is going to be okay. You can hear that in Israel also a few times. If there's a correlation without that group or another group, everything will be just great. But when you look from outside, at least I hope, when you look from outside, you see a Jewish nation in our country, or a Jewish nation all throughout the world that have a lot in common and a lot of aspects that are in common, and differences are not as great as some people will try from a political point of view to try to pinpoint as those are. So I think there's a very solid connection between the three lectures.
Thank you, Doren. I appreciate it. Yasher koach, thank you so much. Wonderful. And proving once again that history is never dry, it's always alive. So we love it. Thank you. And I apologize, I have to head out to go teach history to grade 5 students, and I'll see everyone later. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much. All right.